Hi. If you've ever wanted to map a parameter to two different MIDI controllers at the same time, or have an automated parameter that can also be controlled manually without broken automation, this might be a plugin for you. Okay, this is a tutorial for the MATO Continuous plugin. I recently developed it along with its partner, the MATO toggle, because I needed to do things that Ableton simply couldn't do on its own. And that's okay. Ableton is a great software that has a lot of features, but sometimes it does have limitations. I find that many of its limitations come in the form of topics relating to MIDI mapping, automation, and how those two things interact or fail to interact with one another. Hence the name MATO, which stands for Mapping Automation Takeover. But the M could also very well stand for MIDI or manual. They're all relevant themes here, and you'll see why once we get into the details. So I have the MATO Continuous plugin loaded up here as an audio effect, and the first thing we're going to do is go through the most important controls to give you a general overview of what this plugin can do and why you might want to use it in your live set. And it might also be helpful to know that if you open up the help menu here, which you can access with Shift ? And hold your mouse over any of the parameters, it will briefly describe their function. So when you first load up the plugin, this is what it'll look like. Gray and boring. Before we can do anything, we need to connect it with another parameter in Ableton via this map button, which is very obviously screaming for our attention. So let's give it a click, and it'll start flashing, which means that the next parameter we click on will become mapped. And you'll see the plugin properly turn on. You can think of this like a remote control over the mapped parameter. We're going to control this knob with this plugin. And this map parameter can be anything you want. A dry-wet knob, a fader, a macro, like this example here, or really anything. However, I don't recommend using it for toggles, things like on and off switches. That's why it's called continuous, because it's for continuous parameters, things like knobs and faders. For controlling toggles, there is a separate plugin called the MATO toggle. Okay, so let's talk about what it actually does. Well, at its core, MATO is a plugin that lets us control a single parameter with two different dials. We have the blue dial, or dial 1, and the red dial, dial 2. Both of these control the mapped parameter. And this little flipper thing here is going to tell us which dial is currently in control. So you can see when I use the blue dial here, it's pointing at the blue dial. That means the blue dial is in control. However, when I use the red dial, it will turn and point at the red dial. When it's moving in between the two, that means that the mapped parameter is also in between the two dial values. That's because there's a crossfade time, so that the parameter never skips or jumps suddenly between values. That crossfade time, or as I call it in this plugin, takeover time, is represented here by these two time dials. This one determines how long it takes dial 1 to take over the parameter, and this one is for dial 2. Right, but you might be asking, why would I need this? Well, there are two primary ways to use MATO. There's the standard mode, which I suppose we could call two-controller mode, and then there's this whole other layer called automation mode, which you can access by clicking this button up in the top right corner. There are very different ways of using it. It's almost like having two different plugins. I'll go into more detail in a bit, but just to quickly explain, the default mode is primarily designed for people who want to control a parameter with two different MIDI controllers. This could be because you have a large stage setup and want to be able to access the parameter from two different locations, or it could be because you're making music with another person and you both want to share control of the same effect. So just to quickly demonstrate, you can just map each of these two knobs to different controllers, which for the sake of practicality, I'm going to use these two knobs right next to each other. And that's pretty much it. Now I can control this one parameter with either of these two knobs. There are a lot of details we can still go into, but that's basically the most important thing to know about default mode, or two-controller mode. But what I use this plugin for the most is automation mode. And this mode is designed for sharing the control between a physical controller and automation, either in a clip or in arrangement mode. In automation mode, dial 2 is meant to be automated, while dial 1 is still mapped to a physical controller. This might be useful for live performers who want to control a parameter with automation, but occasionally take manual control, and then smoothly give it back to the automation. And I'll demonstrate that one more time here. So I'm taking control of the mapped parameter, and then I'm going to let go, and it'll smoothly float back to the automation. Okay, now I'm going to use this EQ8 as our mapped parameter, and I'm going to control the gain of this band with the MATO continuous plugin. And I'm just doing that because it's going to be much easier to see what's going on. So now we can very clearly see the value of the mapped parameter. So you can see that as I move back and forth between the two different dials, there's this crossfade happening. So just to demonstrate again, I'll wiggle these dials and you can see the value jumping back and forth smoothly over the span of 1 second in both directions. But let's change that. So now I'm going to make the time going to dial 2 a little bit longer, and I'll make the time going to dial 1 a bit shorter. So now when I move dial 2, it's going to take much longer to arrive at that new value. And when I wiggle dial 1 here, it's going to go much faster. There are all sorts of reasons why you might want to adjust the takeover time, and ultimately it just depends what you're using it for. And you might also be noticing that the movement between the two dials is not quite linear. It kind of follows an S-curve path between the two values, which is represented here in this middle section. And by default, the curve is set to automatic mode, which means as I adjust the time, it will automatically adjust the curve to the most natural value. And if I bring it all the way down to 0, it's obviously going to be linear because you can't curve over no time. But as the time increases, it will slowly start to curve more. And as we reach about 1 second, it'll be at the apex of the curve. And then as I continue to increase it, it will become more and more linear all the way up to 10 seconds, where it's not quite linear, but it's certainly less curved. And when I say these are the most natural values, I just mean that this is what works best for me. But I know that there will be a lot of people who will want to set the curve time manually. So that's why if you click this little button here, you enable manual curve mode, where you can set the curve as you like it, which also lets you make the curve a bit sharper if you want. Okay, so let's take a look at that in action. I'm going to set this back to 1 second so it matches. And this one's going to stay in automatic mode, so it'll be curved, whereas this one will be linear. So now as I move to dial 1, it follows a linear path, and going to dial 2 will still be curved. And one more time. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention here, but if you click the little button on the flipper, it will move back and forth between the two dials. And you can also map this to a controller. Okay, but back to the curves. You might be wondering why use a linear path when you could use an S-curve. Well, setting it to linear actually saves a bit on CPU. So if the parameter you're controlling is not very important, you might want to consider putting it in a linear path, which uses a simpler algorithm to make that crossover. However, it's not that big of a difference. So unless you have a really massive live set, you probably don't have to worry about it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about these two buttons over here on the left side of the device. And to do that, I'm going to map the two dials to knobs on two different controllers. Okay, and now we can see that it works normally, where Each dial can control the map parameter. But you might notice that the top controller here is using an infinite spin rotary encoder, which means the knob itself can spin endlessly, and the value of the parameter is shown by an LED ring around the knob. And if you have one of these kinds of controllers, you might want to consider using infinite spin mode, which is not a cycle on a washing machine. Rather, it just means that if it's engaged on dial 1 will update its value to match dial 2 in real time. So now when I move dial 2, which is still set to fixed position mode, you can see that the value of dial 1 is updated in real time and displayed on the LED ring on the physical controller. But of course, when I move dial 1, it will not update the position of dial 2. And it might be worth pointing out here, if you had a motorized fader, it would theoretically work in the same way, but I've never personally tested that out. And just a quick tip here, if you look at the position we're in, although I'm in control of dial 2, since we're in infinite spin mode, the position of dial 1 already matches the position of dial 2, and therefore there's no need for a takeover time. Takeover time is only necessary if the position of the two dials are mismatched at the moment of taking control. So we can safely set that to 0 seconds and not worry about it skipping or jumping when you take over. But of course, when we do go back to dial 2, we're going to want to use a takeover time to ensure a smooth transition. So I'll just show that one more time. I can immediately take over control with dial 1. And when I go back to dial 2, you can see it crossfade a bit over that 1 second. And of course, you can set either or both of these to be in infinite spin mode. But something I definitely want to point out here is you see this little warning sign pop up. If you click on it, it will give you this message: infinite spin mode will flood your undo history. Be careful. Yeah, infinite spin mode will flood your undo history. And the reason for this is just a technical thing between Max for Live and Ableton. Basically, if you have any parameter that is capable of being automated or mapped, which of course both of these two dials need to be, every time it makes a movement, it will be stored in Ableton's undo history. So just as an example, if dial 1 is set to infinite spin mode and I move dial 2, it will also store that same movement on dial 1 in the undo history. So now if I wanted to undo this action, it would move dial 2 back to its previous position, but that in turn would cause dial 1 to move again. So for every action you try to undo, it creates a new action, making it impossible to move backwards. Basically, use infinite spin mode at your own risk. Okay, lastly, I'm going to quickly explain the minimum, maximum, and exponent number boxes here on the top panel. The minimum and maximum simply set the output range of the map parameter. So right now we're at 0% on the dial, and it's at 0% here on the map parameter. But if I were to set the minimum to, say, 25%, we can see that we've raised the floor, making it now impossible to lower the value below this point. And if we put this to the top here, we can also see that similarly, if we lower the maximum, we've lowered the ceiling and limited the high end of possible values. Although this excludes part of the parameter's range, it might be useful if you want more fine control within a specific range. And I'll also point out here that if we put the minimum above the maximum, it's essentially like inverting the dial. Okay, the exponent is a bit different in that it sets the exponential curve that the parameter follows as it moves between the minimum and maximum. At an exponent of 1, which is the default, the movement is totally linear. That is to say, at 50%, the parameter is also at 50%. And at 25%, it's also at 25%, etc. If we set the exponent higher than 1, the parameter follows a curved path that moves more slowly in the low end and more quickly in the high end. This means that we use up most of the dial in the first half of the parameters range, giving us more fine control in the low end, whereas we have much less fine control in the high end. And if we set the exponent below 1, now it's the opposite. We have more control in the high end, whereas the low end slopes very quickly. Okay, so in this example, I'm going to demonstrate how to use the MATO continuous plugin in automation mode. I've got it loaded up here, but I'm going to close it just for a second so we can focus on this other stuff, which is I've got an operator synth, and some of its parameters here are mapped to a macro dial. So you can see is that as I move this, a lot of these parameters move in unison. So it's basically just opening the filter along with a couple other things. So I've called it filter open. Right. So I also have a MIDI clip here, and it's got a sequence of notes in it as well as some clip automation. You can see this in the envelopes tab here, and it is controlling that same filter open parameter. So when I press play, we can see that it's moving this parameter in accordance to the clip automation. That's all fine. This is normal Ableton stuff. Right, but what would happen if I wanted to have it automated like this, but every once in a while, like in a live performance, I wanted to take control of it manually with maybe a knob and then give it back to the automation when I'm done. So let's map this to a controller. And now whenever I move this knob, I have control over it. But if I want to give it back, I'm forced to press this button here that causes it to just instantaneously snap back to the automation values. And what's even worse is now my knob here is in the wrong position. So the second I touch it, it's going to instantaneously snap back. And rinse and repeat. Okay, so this sucks, and this is actually the primary reason I first created the MATO continuous plugin. So now I'm going to show you how you can use this to fix the problem. All right, the first thing we're going to want to do is save the automation if we like it. So let's go up into this clip here and select all, copy, and then we're going to delete it. So it's saved in my copy bank. Let's not forget about that. Next thing is we're going to press the map button and click the filter open parameter. And now they're linked up. And as I demonstrated before, I can now control the filter open with either one of these two dials, dial 1 or dial 2. But now we're going to work in automation mode. So we're going to click the automation button up here, and we'll see the A gets a little exclamation mark, and the bottom panel here turns a shade of pink. And this button here also changes, but we're going to talk about that in a second. The next thing, before I forget about having copied that automation, I'm going to wiggle this dial 2 here, the automation dial, and come up here back into the clip and paste it in. So it's the same as it was before, essentially. So now when I play this clip, it will control dial 2 with the clip envelope automation, which is controlling the filter open macro. So you might already see where I'm going with this, but we can use dial 1 to take control of the parameter without breaking the automation. The way we do this is, let's go back to MIDI mapping and make sure that we remove it from this one. And let's move it over here to dial 1. So now this knob is controlling dial 1. And when I start wiggling it around, we take control of the parameter. You can see that it's in sync with dial 1. But when I let go, it smoothly fades back to the automation. So you'll notice that rather than breaking the automation, it simply deactivates it temporarily and reactivates it when you let go. Now, the amount of time you have before it gives back the control to the automation is determined by the hold time here. So right now it's going to hold for 500 milliseconds or half a second. And if I don't make any movements to the dial within that amount of time, within that window of time, it will think that I'm done using it and it'll take back control, it'll give back the control to automation. So if I were to make this, say, 2 seconds, it'd be a little bit more clear. So I can basically let go of it for longer. Now, as long as I make a movement within 2-second windows, I will maintain control. But if I wait longer than 2 seconds, it will give the control back to the automation. I think half a second is a pretty natural time. And you can kind of just wiggle it in place if you want to hold control of it without moving it too much. You can just kind of keep wiggling it, and you'll hold control of it, and then you can let go and it fades back. And of course, the time it takes to take over control and give back is just the same as in 2-knob mode. I can make it a little bit faster or slower, depending on the parameter and what I want. So now it takes control a little bit faster, and when I let go, it moves back more slowly. I can also put this into manual mode if I click this button. And manual mode just simply means that it's not going to automatically give control back to the automation when we let go. So once I take control, it's just gonna stay in my control until I press the little tiny return to automation button here. On my setup, I have this button mapped to a physical button right underneath the knob, so I can choose when to give control back to the automation. Okay, so this next bit gets a little bit confusing, but just hang in there with me, it will make sense. So let's imagine we have some different automation here. Rather than having this moving automation that's continuously being updated every moment, we have it automated, but it's stagnant. And this might make more sense if the clip were longer and it was in one position for half the clip and another position for the other half of the clip. But just for the sake of explaining, I'm going to leave it totally stagnant right now so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so so the dial 2 is automated, but it's not moving. Now let's go back to automatic mode. Remember, this is usually where if you let go of it, it will automatically move back to the automation. However, I was kind of lying when I explained that before, because it's not always true. If the dial 2 is not moving, not being updated, then automatic mode behaves kind of like manual mode. So this means that when I take control and let go, yes, the dial is re-enabled, but it doesn't actually snap back until this button is pressed. Or if the knob does move, if the automation changes and wiggles, it will take control again. But usually you're going to want to have this button here physically present on your controller somewhere. You're going to map it to your controller so that you can decide to give it back to the automation whenever you're done. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I think the best way to understand this is just to play around with it a little bit and try out different scenarios, and it'll start to become quite intuitive. Okay, so now I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the Return to Automation button. And I'm going to show another not so obvious way that you can get the mapped parameter to return to the automation value. So in this example, I've got an auto filter with the frequency mapped to the plugin. And I'm going to MIDI map Looks like I already had that there. I'm going to MIDI map it again just to show to the fader. And then I'm going to map the return to automation button to the R button on my controller. So as I take manual control, we can see that as the return to automation button turns red, so does the controller. And I can press this here to have it return to the automation value. So that's one way to do it. And just as a recap, another way to do it, like I showed before, is just that if the automation value changes, it will serve as a return to automation button. So I'll show that real quick. If I take manual control and then it starts moving, it will move back to the automation value. Unless, of course, you are wiggling this in real time. If you're moving it, you'll keep control of it. And then if you let go, it'll return, just like I showed before. Okay, so for this next example, let's imagine a scenario where, let's say you don't have any automation here, and going into the B section of your song, you want to make sure that no matter what, the map parameter goes back to the automation value of 15% here. And maybe you're going to be at the controller, maybe you're not, maybe you're going to be doing something else, and you want to make sure that even if you forget to press that manual button here, it will be there at that 15% at this point. Well, one way you could do that would just be to kind of wiggle the automation a little bit so that it will move back. But it's kind of a sloppy way to do it, especially if you want to make sure that it's completely flat. I've never run into a situation where it's necessary, but I can imagine that it would be possible. So you might think that a cleaner way to do this would be, rather than mapping this to the controller, we could just automate this. So I'll show this in a new lane here, and automate the button so that it punches it right before the B section. And in principle, this is a good idea. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. So when I take manual control, it breaks. And that's just how it is. It just doesn't work as an automatable parameter, unfortunately. And this is just sort of a technical problem with the way the back end of the plugin works. So unfortunately, that can't be automated. However, there is a nice workaround. Let me just map this again. And this workaround is that the little flipper button here can essentially serve as a second return to automation button. And if you remember, in the normal mode, the two controller mode, the little flipper button just toggles back and forth between the two dial values. Well, in the automation mode, it won't move to dial 1, but it only moves to dial 2. So if I have control on dial 1 and click it, it goes to dial 2, but clicking it again won't go back to dial 1. So it's basically just a second return to automation button. However, the back end functions slightly differently, and that means that you can automate it. So let's automate this here. And just a quick note, it doesn't matter how long the thing stays up. The only important thing is that basically when it goes up, it'll punch the button. The going back down is just a formality, so it really doesn't matter if it's here or here. So let's take a look at that in action. So if I have control, as we approach the B section, it will automatically go back to the automated value. So that's 3 different ways you can do it. You can move the automation and it'll return. You can do this manually with a button on your controller, or you can have it automated at a certain point to return. And I use all 3 of these together in my live set in different contexts. So there's actually one last control on this device that you haven't seen yet, and you haven't seen it because it's not visible. It's actually hidden, and it's called the secret dial. You can only see it here in the bottom right corner, this little tiny blue dot, if you go into MIDI mapping mode. Otherwise, it's invisible. And the reason why it's invisible is just because I'm pretty sure that nobody's ever going to use it. There really might just be 1% of users who ever need this functionality, so I just didn't see a need to put it on the main interface. But I will show you really quickly what it does. So let's imagine a scenario where I map the resonance of this filter to this knob up here. So now I have control of the frequency with the fader, and I can control the resonance with this knob. And let's say that whenever I want to move the resonance, make even a slight adjustment to it, I want the return to automation to automatically be triggered. And if I were to do this by mapping the return to automation button to the dial, it only ever works when you cross the halfway point. And that's just kind of how Ableton treats toggles and buttons when using a dial. You have to cross the halfway point, and then it will activate the button. But what if you wanted to activate the button with any movement you make? Well, in that case, you just map the same controlling knob to the secret dial as well. So I'm going to take this knob and twist it here after pressing the little blue button. You can kind of see there that it's mapped. It's really hard to see, but it is mapped. And now when I turn the resonance knob, it will also press the return automation button. So any little movement will trigger the button. I'll show that again. So I'm in control here with the fader, and then I make an adjustment to the resonance, and it'll trigger the return to automation. So I can't really think of many uses for the secret dial, but it was really easy to build in, so I just put it in, and I hope that someone out there can make some use of it. And if you do end up using it, let me know. I'm genuinely curious what it could be used for. So if you do find some practical purpose for it, let me know in the comments or write me a message. And one last thing to mention, just like infinite spin mode, the secret dial will also flood your undo history, although for a different reason, but that doesn't matter. So just wanted to put that warning out there. Be careful with it. Okay, so I think that's it. Thanks for sticking around this far. It's been a long video, but there was a lot to cover in this deceptively complicated little device. In part 2 of this tutorial series, I'm going to cover its baby sibling plugin, the MATO toggle, which is much more simple, but equally useful in certain situations. And speaking of the MATO toggle, there's one last thing that I want to show you in this video, which is that I want to give you a taste for the possibilities of combining these two plugins. So here I'm using all 4 of these MATO plugins to control this one erosion device. And with this simple on-off toggle, I can set the erosion frequency to 3 different positions. So whenever I toggle it on, it moves to either the low or high value, and turning it off returns to the middle position. And every time it goes on, it switches between the low and high values. And I can also control this toggle through a button press that has a certain set duration, either a half note at live tempo or 500 milliseconds. So obviously this example is a bit over the top, but it's just to show that there's a lot you can do with this plugin, especially when you combine it with the MATO toggle. Since adding this tool to my live set, I honestly don't know how I went so many years without it, especially automation mode. My hope in releasing it is that it's as useful for you as it is for me. So see you in part 2 of this tutorial where I talk about the MATO toggle. And don't worry, it will be much shorter than this video.